I don't know what it is about Southern California, but man, it is the breeding ground for some wild cults. The counterculture movement of the late 1960s had young people rejecting established religion, institutions, and materialism of their parents, but still wanting somewhere to belong. People searched for new meaning, new family. Minds were more open to new ideas and expanding boundaries. And in many ways, that's honestly a great thing. It gave rise to the civil rights movement, open-mindedness about racial equality, and equal rights for women. All very great things. It also opened the door for charismatic leaders like Charles Manson and Jim Jones and today's David Berg to step in and give people some new meaning, give them a new leader and a new God. New leaders that God somehow always told to take money from their members, marry lots of women, cheat, lie, and in this case, support pedophilia. David Berg, a charismatic preacher who left the traditional Christian church and formed the Children of God in 1968, is going to be our main character for today. He believed that the apocalypse was near, they always do, and urged believers to survive on basic necessities by giving up their money and personal possessions to the group leaders, and by the group leaders, he meant him. He also infamously taught that God is love and love is sex. The cult was notoriously suspected of rampant sexual abuse of women and children, all supported by its sex-crazed leader, David Yikes on Bikes Berg. So much more on that later. Like many cults, we're going to get some heavy doses of no way, what the fuck, and how in the Hello Kitty did people believe in this? Buckle up and let's hit the road to Los Angeles, the home of some of the most famous and diabolical cults in American history, on today's episode of Highway to Hell. Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hell, the travel and true crime podcast. My name is Monty, rock singer, gym junkie, president of the I Can't Wait Until Kendrick Lamar Slays Drake Again, and today I'm going to be your cult leader. Follow me on a journey and listen to the sweet, sultry sound of my voice. Give me all your money. I'm kidding. But if you want to buy me a coffee, that's great. I'm excited to investigate our first true crime cult, but before I do, a couple announcements. With last week's episode, I realized that there was some sound leakage. The house that I was recording in, there was work being done in one of the other rooms. I thought I was far enough away that it wouldn't be heard, but it did bleed through. So I apologize on that. You can hear a voice in the background. But my intention is this week to re-record that episode and upload it, just to have it better sound quality. I always want to do the best that I possibly can with that, so I apologize. The other thing is, if you're watching on YouTube and you see that it's just kind of a podcast cover, that is because there is not a video with this episode. Since I got back to Nashville after my month of travel in April, I have had chronic, spiky, very painful headaches every day. And today has been the worst one that I've ever had. And so I couldn't get my contacts in. I couldn't even put mascara on. The left side of my face is just streaming tears involuntarily. And I'm currently propped up on the couch, laying on an ice pack on my neck to do this because I don't want to miss the week, but I'm also suffering a little bit. I'm going to see my chiropractor and my massage therapist tomorrow. Hopefully they can fix it, but I just wanted to let you know. So this is still going to be on YouTube. There just won't be an accompanying video to go with it. Today we're going to dive into the Children of God sex cult, which is just a crazy part of the counterculture movement and all of the cults that we saw pop up in the 60s and 70s. So on today's episode, I'm going to give you a brief history of America's counterculture movement, how it set a lot of people up to fall prey to cult leaders, and we'll cover the history and the crimes of the Children of God cult, specifically their leader David Berg, and of course we'll talk travel recommendations in LA. This is another one of those cities that there's so many things that you could talk about, so many things you could do. It's definitely going to be a city that I know will have a lot of episodes on in the future. Really excited. It's a great place to visit. But let's hit the road and let's talk about American counterculture movement. The counterculture movement in America, particularly prominent during the 1960s and 70s, had a profound period of social, political, and cultural change. It originated in the late 50s and gained significant momentum in the 60s. It was primarily driven by a younger generation that was disillusioned with the societal norms and the political landscape of the time. Sound familiar? Some of these issues included the Cold War and the nuclear threat. America's dropping of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II ushered in a terrifying new era with weapons that could level cities and decimate countries. The ethics of using such a weapon were hotly contested. America was also in the throes of the Cold War, where nuclear threats, espionage, fear, and the threat of the Iron Curtain was a very present part of American culture. Fear of the nuclear war and the disillusionment with the arms race prompted a lot of anti-war sentiments. The anti-war sentiments exploded during Vietnam. Number 2 was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s was a pivotal era in American history, marked by a widespread and vigorous campaign against racial segregation and the discrimination toward African Americans. This movement sought to achieve legal and social equity through nonviolent protests, legal challenges, and civil disobedience. 1960 marked the sit-in at Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro by 4 African-American college students, which ignited a wave of similar protests in the South. In 1961, the Freedom Rides challenged segregation in interstate bus terminals across the South that led to violent reactions, including mobilizing the KKK, and eventually required federal intervention. In 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom highlighted the need for equal economic rights, and this is where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. Finally, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965, which highlighted the suppression of black voting rights in the South, led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This was key legislation that aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Number 3 was consumerism and corporate culture. The younger American generation of the late 50s and early 60s rejected the materialistic values and the conformity that was heavily pressed on American culture in the post-World War era of prosperity. Think 1950s, everything's perfect. It's the perfect housewife. You have the perfect house, the cute picket fence, the 2 kids. The generation grows up and they're like, I don't care about this stuff. I don't want to be forced into this life. This isn't working for me. And also, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. What people fail to recognize is that in the 1950s, housewives were heavily addicted to opiates and various forms of drugs just to cope with life. Women weren't allowed to work. Domestic violence was rampant. It was this whole it was marketed as this perfect life. But the children who grew up at that time understood that it wasn't. So as they get older, there's this disillusionment with their environment that they want to change. And again, the threat of the Cold War, the divide of values, and the growing lack of trust in the government that would peak with President Nixon and the Watergate scandal. The key issue here being the Vietnam War led people to believe that maybe going to church, college, getting married, the picket fence, the 2 kids wasn't all there is. Key features of the counterculture, many of which are still associated with it, were, number 1, music and art. What a time to be alive if you're a lover of music. Artists like the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, the Doors, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Jimi Hendrix were all pivotal players in the movement, and there's so many more beyond that. I'm just mentioning a few. Beyond being pivotal pieces in the evolution and the culture of music, they promoted messages of rejecting societal norms, promoting peace and love, and a powerful anti-war sentiment. Obviously, there were so many more artists, but I just want to mention these because they tend to come up a lot in this counterculture discussion. An example of music reflecting the values of the counterculture is the song Ohio by Crosby, Stills, and Nash, which was released after 4 students at Kent State were killed during a protest. Here's a clip of that song.
Twin soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, for dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it, soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago.
counterculture movement was also followed by a huge interest in communal living, alternative lifestyles, psychedelics, more on that later, and alternative and Eastern medicine. Drug use became prevalent during this time in the absence of federal regulation. Drugs such as LSD, marijuana were prevalent and seen as a way to expand your consciousness and evolve. Something interesting is happening in today's culture. We're in a similar space of distrust with politics and the law, particularly my generation, with government and the economy, living in an economy where, and I'm a younger millennial, we can't buy homes, people can't afford to buy groceries. We've been fed this lie. It's a lie of, oh, well, if you go to college and you get married and you do this, everything's going to be fine. And that's just simply not the case. We're living in an environment where real estate prices have gone up 4 times, and minimum wage has gone up, a couple dollars in the past 50 years. We've witnessed money go to wars while people don't have clean water. People can't buy homes and groceries. We're still fighting for civil rights and equal rights between men and women. And there's now a growing interest in the use of psychedelics. It's the highest I've seen or that has been documented to my knowledge since the original counterculture movement. I personally think that we're on the doorstep of another counterculture movement, and we're going to fight some of those same battles again. I think we're going to see a lot of music that's really powerful come out. I think we're going to see a lot of music that's about real issues come out. I think we're going to see a lot of pushback towards funding the military when we're not taking care of our citizens. We're going to see a lot of conversations around the economy, civil rights, equal rights for the sexes. I think it's all coming back. Lastly, counterculture was marked by the persistent political activism. The original counterculture focused on the Vietnam War, promoting civil rights, and fostering environmental activism. I'm very interested to see the new movement fight for some of those same things. So how did the counterculture affect the explosion of cults? So don't get me wrong, modern cults are very much a thing. They're recruiting. But what is it about this era, the 60s and 70s, that was such an environment to foster the cults that are so famous today? The first thing was spiritual experimentation. One of the hallmarks of counterculture was this quest for spiritual meaning outside of religious frameworks. Evangelical Christianity, being the dominant religion in America, faced a lot of opposition due to its opposition to the civil rights and feminist movements. Interestingly enough, so I went to Liberty University, which I don't normally tell people, but Jerry Falwell, the original founder of Liberty University, was actually very opposed to desegregation. So much so that when he founded the Liberty Christian Academy, which is the grade school and high school attached to Liberty University, it was founded as an all-white private school so that parents wouldn't have to send their children to desegregated public schools. So American evangelicalism faced a lot of pushback because they opposed the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. It's important to know in history that for evangelicals, abortion was not an issue at all until after they lost their fight against the civil rights movement. That's when they latched onto the abortion issue, and that became a primary focal point. Just an interesting little tidbit of history. Most of America's cults were spin-offs of traditional Western Christianity and Mormonism. Cult leaders used this familiarity as a way to make people feel comfortable with the initial ideas, and this also increased interest in Eastern religions, mysticism, and alternative spiritual practices, which were sometimes mixed into new syncretic beliefs. These conditions made it easier for charismatic leaders to establish cults centered around novel and esoteric teachings. So there was different varieties of cults. Some of them were like, hey, it's this familiar twist on a religion you already know. And some of them were like, hey, we know you're interested in meditation. Come over here and we're going to loop you in that way. But there was also this rejection of traditional authority. The counterculture's challenge to established institutions included a skepticism of mainstream religious organizations. It was all this questioning. Why is it this way? Why has it always been this way? Why should I do this? Why should I accept this? This skepticism often manifested as a search for more radical and transformative spiritual experiences, which is exactly what cults promised. As mentioned before, the counterculture promoted alternative lifestyles, including communal living, which was also a common feature in many cults. Isolate people, get them all together, get them in this kind of bubble where they're not exposed to the outside teachings of the world. These communal settings often helped reinforce the cult's control over its members' lives, created insular environments where the groupthink could prevail, and individual dissent could be minimized and manipulated. Lastly, many young people felt alienated from mainstream society due to the political disillusionment and the dissatisfaction they were feeling, and they were feeling a lack of personal connection to their communities. Cults offered all of this. Cults are, in a lot of ways, carry the same attraction that gangs do for a lot of impoverished areas. It promises family, protection, a place to belong, a family, a set of beliefs, a set of rules. It's all kind of the same appeal. And just before I jump into the Children of God cult, I want to talk about some notable cults and their impact in American society. The first one, obviously, is the Manson family, perhaps one of the most infamous cults of the era. Charles Manson exploited the counterculture themes of the apocalypse and the revolution to manipulate his followers into committing heinous crimes, including the Tate LaBianca murders in 1969. And it's so interesting. Manson is this terrifying looking human. There's nothing really outstanding about him physically at all, but so compelling. This man was so compelling. He was able to manipulate people to such extreme lengths. And it was an interesting legal case because he never actually killed anyone. But because he orchestrated the murders, in an effort to start his race war, his helter-skelter race war, he was also put in prison for life, which is just a crazy thought. The second is the People's Temple, Jim Jones. He started the People's Temple in Indiana, but it reached its infamous culmination in Jonestown, Guyana. Initially, Jones drew on themes of social justice and racial equality, appealing to progressive ideals, before leading his followers into one of the most tragic mass suicides in history. And then number 3, the Unification Church, or the Moonies. Founded by Sun Myung Moon, the Unification Church gained traction in the United States during the counterculture era. It was known for its mass wedding ceremonies and its conservative political activism, which was somewhat at odds with the broader counterculture movement, but still drew on the era's themes of communal effort and spiritual seeking. The spiritualist pursuit of the counterculture, while healthy in some ways, it's so important to question your beliefs. It's so important to question your worldview. Make sure that you're not locked into something that isn't true or is outdated. So important. But it highlighted this fine line between utopian ideals and what can become dangerous extremism. So as someone who grew up in a very strict evangelical Christian environment with some pretty radical ideas, I wasn't taught much about the counterculture movement growing up, or even the civil rights movement and the impact on society. So I wanted to include some of the history here because it's absolutely critical to the founding of cults in America, the crimes they were able to commit, with the radical followings that just defy our logical thought as we look back on them now. Cults like the Children of God's cult. And before I jump into the history of this particular cult, this is the best time for our mid-show sponsor break. This episode is brought to you by Intravenous Solutions, Nashville's premier therapy and wellness center. IV therapy can help you recover quickly from heavy workouts or illness, treat the symptoms of dehydration, and improve sleep and give you healthy, glowing skin. Being on stage several times a week, as well as personal training full-time, I can say that IV treatments keep me on my feet and are a lifesaver. Dr. Allen and his staff are so kind and so knowledgeable, and they make every appointment welcoming and easy. They offer vitamin shots, oxygen therapy, Botox, filler, weight management, and mobile services. With 4 locations in Nashville, Hendersonville, Franklin, and their brand new location on 2nd Avenue, it is so easy to get high-quality care all week. So come party in Nashville, see the band, work out with me, whatever you want to do, and beat the hangover with Intravenous Solutions. Give the code Monty10 at checkout for a 10% discount on services. And we're also brought to you by the Nashville for Nobodies podcast. It's a podcast hosted by Bobby Gordon along with co-host Kyle Thurkey that discusses the Nashville music scene, the ins and outs of Lower Broadway, and the lives of active musicians in the Nashville area. Nashville for Nobodies interviews local and touring and studio musicians, as well as other music industry professionals. And now, time for the Children of God cult. David Berg was born in Oakland, California, February 18th, 1919, while his parents were traveling in California as the Berg Evangelistic Dramatic Company. Really, really rolls off the tongue. He's easy to pronounce, easy to remember. David grew up traveling with his parents preaching the gospel, particularly with his mother, who called herself a divine healer, even though there was never any evidence of that whatsoever. It was later discovered that David was repeatedly sexually abused by both sexes in this religious organization his parents ran, and had an incestuous relationship at the age of 7. David, unsurprisingly, had a dramatically unhealthy and obsessive view on sex by the time he was a teen, which conflicted heavily with his mother's rigid form of spirituality. In 1941, David was drafted into the military at the age of 22 and sent to Fort Belvoir, home of the Army Engineers. When David was, according to him, struck with double pneumonia in 1942, he would later claim that he promised God that if God saved his life, he would serve him his entire life. According to David, he was then instantly and miraculously healed. In 1944, David met and eloped with young Jane Miller, a young church secretary that he met in Glendale, California. David decided to become an ordained minister in 1948 and worked for the Christian and Missionary Alliance. He eventually left the alliance. When I see or hear the word alliance, like all I can think of is the Dwight Schrute clip.
Do you want to form an alliance with me?
Absolutely, I do.
Good, excellent.
I met someone the other day who has never seen The Office, and I was and still am deeply disturbed by this. But let's get back to David Berg. In 1950, he claimed due to his strong sermons and progressive ideals, he was kicked out of the alliance, but everyone else would say it was because he had an affair with a member of the congregation. I'm going to guess it was number 2. He would have several falling outs with organizations due to cheating on his wife with members of his flock. He spent the remainder of the 50s driving school buses and working odd jobs before working for Fred Jordan at the Soul Clinic in Los Angeles for his TV program, Church in the Home. David really loved working with Jordan and his emphasis on personal witnessing. This would become a huge, trademark quality of the cult that David Berg would later form. In 1965 and 1966, David's mother, Virginia Berg, made 2 prophecies about him. She claimed that David was God's prophet for the ending of days, and later that he was the prophet of the last generation. So, Mama, again, who's this divine healer, she claimed she healed herself from paralysis, even though there was no proof that she was ever paralyzed. So what she's doing is she's like, yes, let's convince baby boy Berg that he is special. Oh my God, you are so special. You're God's prophet. It can't be your fault. It's everyone else's fault. They don't understand you. They don't understand your power, because this sets us all up for healthy religious beliefs later on. Of course it does. David spent time in Miami at a missionary school associated with the Soul Clinic, but was eventually stopped by local authorities for overly aggressive recruitment tactics. I wish I knew what those were. I tried to find out what he was doing, but he literally Miami. The city of Miami was like, you gotta leave. You can't be here doing that. David's totally logical and I'm sure well-founded response to this was that the Jews pushed him out of Florida. No proof, no context for this, of course. The entire Berg family began to work as traveling evangelists, and Deere was just thinking with my dick David was becoming progressively more at odds with the traditional church, particularly around the ideas of sexuality, fidelity, and incest. That's fun. People who knew the family and family members said during this time David was sleeping with prostitutes, house cleaners, nannies, and fellow congregants. In the late 60s, he also made sexual advances on his own daughters. After getting kicked out of towns repeatedly for inappropriate conduct, especially towards children, like a true prophet of God does, 49-year-old David Berg returns to Huntington Beach to move in with his mom. Because moving back in with mom at nearly 50 is just, proof that God has a divine plan for his life. And not only is he moving in with his mom, with his entire family, he's moving in because he literally cannot keep it in his pants and is getting kicked out of every town he goes to. What a keeper. Researching this guy, I realized that I shouldn't be so hard on myself. I feel like a failure so often, I haven't done enough, I haven't achieved enough, and then I look at this and I'm like, you know what? I'm doing okay. I'm fine. In Huntington Beach, David decided his new targets would be the youth of the counterculture movement. He would use his 4 teenage children to lure other teens in early 20s to hear him speak, and after getting a few members locked in, he forced them into rigorous Bible study and memorization and a big emphasis on evangelical work and bringing more people into the group. He, of course, had a very initially Bible-based message. You can't jump right into pedophilia and incest. People don't like that. No. We can't scare off the new converts. And you can't go full Drake until you've got enough of a cult following. He did use scripture and the rejection of materialism that was already happening in the counterculture to convince his new followers to forsake all, school, family, responsibilities, and follow him. Follow God. He encouraged his followers to return home and what he called plunder Egypt, i.e. steal anything of value and sell it and give their money to him. Cults tend to have a lot of red flags, like circus tent-sized red flags. And one of these red flags happens to be that if your new church leader wants you to sell off everything you can get your hands on and give the money to him, you're probably in a cult or something that's headed towards a cult. I'm not talking about tithing. I'm talking about rob your parents and give the money to me. Kind of seems like a problem. Not surprisingly, when locals found out that he was encouraging young people to rob their families and then cut ties, they wanted David and his people to leave. Conveniently, God's timing being perfect, David received a prophecy that a massive earthquake was coming to destroy all the coastal cities, and he and his followers must flee. And to be clear, when I make these jokes, I'm not ridiculing God or religion. I am blatantly ridiculing cult leaders like David. The only part that matters is my dongle Berg. Okay, I'm making fun of these people. And later, the stupid people that will follow them. The cult relocated to Tucson before getting kicked out of there for their demonstrations. They ended up moving all around the U.S. and Canada, being removed from multiple cities. In 1970, 150 members of the group established a 450-acre colony in Texas. Lots of compounds popping up in Texas in and around this time, and they established their world headquarters in Montreal. It was during this time that David finally achieved his dream of openly sleeping with his cult members using a prophecy that he received from God, of course, to justify taking a second wife, that polygamy should be allowed, of course. Shortly after this, promiscuity and partner swapping became rampant in the church leadership. This wouldn't be extended to the rest of the cult until later. David divided his church into 12 groups inspired by the 12 tribes of Israel, enforced weird budgets that included, this is not a joke, I didn't make this up, you could only use 2 sheets of toilet paper in the bathroom. Which, never eat Taco Bell. Like, under any circumstances. If 2 sheets is your allowance, I'm just imagining, like, what if someone is sick? Anyways, I'm not going to go into poop joke territory. I'm not going to do it. He also imposed a buddy system that nobody from the cult could go anywhere without a cult member. Why? Because you got to prevent escape. You can't let people think on their own. This is another cult red flag. Exhausted and overworked cult members were forced into rigorous Bible studies and scripture memorization. It's super common in cults to keep people so exhausted they can't function, they can't think. There's not enough downtime for them to see through the cult leader's nonsense. The cult began recruiting on television and promoting a biblical school that they established that they also used a strange incentive to recruit students to: draft dodging. It turns out that if you became an ordained minister, you didn't have to go to Vietnam. New converts were taught total subservience to the cult. Things are starting to ramp up. David convinces his followers that the government is Satan and any established leader is the enemy. Now, I can't totally disagree on the government part, but he takes this in a direction that is just disgusting and psychotic. He would now start to ramp up to sex-crazed cult leader. Remember, you can't start there. It starts with Jesus and love and the Bible, and then you start throwing out, well, hey, maybe me as God's prophet should be able to take more wives. Or maybe me as God's prophet should be able to sleep with anyone in the congregation I want. And then he starts to add crazy ideas as we go. Many former members of church leadership would discuss how in meetings, Berg would introduce a sexual topic that would then lead to orgies. Church orgies, as the good Lord intended. It takes the invitation of come to church into a very different space. Again, this was just church leadership at this point. The rest of the cult was actually forced into celibacy, which is so weird. It's such a weird contrast, especially with what happens later. At a certain point, Berg and his second wife flee to London to avoid scrutiny from law enforcement into their activities. Rumors were starting to spread about where they're getting their money from, that maybe they're fraudulently fundraising, and there's starting to be rumors of rape, coercion, and sexual abuse. Here, David writes books and releases a series of Mo letters because he changed his name to Moses David. Another red flag. If your church leader or your religious leader suddenly changes their name to this really strange sounding biblical name to give themselves more credence, you might be in a cult, or in the beginning of a cult. Who knows? So Moses David Berg, he predicts that the last 7 years of world history will begin in 1982 and that he himself will die in 1989. He somehow doesn't lose his followers when neither of these things happen because he didn't die until 1994. That's something that's interesting to me about doomsday cults, is they'll make these predictions, which, why do you keep making predictions when you're always wrong? And then people don't leave when it doesn't, like, nobody confronts it when it doesn't happen. It's just an interesting cognitive dissonance to me. The big issue here with this belief that the world was ending is that a lot of people within the cult didn't make long-term plans. They stopped their education, they quit jobs, they neglected saving money, they didn't save for retirement, which are huge problems when your cult leader's prediction doesn't come true. From London, Berg pushes his group to heavily recruit, and by 1972, the group grew to 1,400 members, mostly teens and young adults. But also, the group had been around for long enough for people to start to leave. That's where things are getting a little spicy. That's where these reports are coming in. The press is starting to pay attention. Law enforcement is starting to pay attention, because members of the group who are leaving are reporting that coercion, the rape, the orgies, the forced isolation, fraud. Parents began to attempt to free their children from the cult, but despite those efforts, the cult continued to grow. Later in 1972, David, or Moses, or whatever he is calling himself, starts to change the sexual boundaries of the cult a lot more publicly. He decided to redefine the family unit and to condone rape and molestation. He doesn't call it that, but in his doctrine of love, which is what he called it in his letters, he states that taking sexual liberties is not wrong in God's eyes if it's done in the name of love. So what he's saying is, if you really want to bone someone, but you have love in your heart, you can just do it, and it's not wrong. He begins arranging and breaking up marriages as he sees fit, often sending partners to different colonies to live. He continues to push for recruitment, and by the end of 1973, there were over 2,000 members in 40 different countries. David keeps a chokehold of leadership of the cult, even as his Mo letters get more controversial. So controversial, in fact, that he started to classify his letters into categories ranging from letters that the general public would get to see and letters for his inner circle only. Again, you don't want to scare off your new recruits. In 1974, the now 55-year-old Berg keeps getting worse. In one of his letters, he demanded that his female followers stop wearing bras or they would be forcefully removed. Berg's stance on sexuality for the group at this point was, married or not, disregarding age, sleep with anyone in the group that you want to. And women were expected to reciprocate the sexual advances of any man within the group who approached them. That if they did not do so, they did not have the love of Christ in their heart. How manipulative. In 1974, this is when Berg introduced the recruitment tactic that would get huge pushback toward the cult, which was called Flirty Fishing. This was the pushing of female members to engage in sexual relationships with non-members in order to recruit them to the cult. A Spanish island that the Children of God had a compound on was where Berg said he tested and perfected his flirty fishing tactics, i.e. he slept with a lot of young women in the cult, regardless of if they wanted to sleep with him or not. And this, while when this was first introduced, it was not like forced, it later became a thing where you would be ostracized or kicked out of the cult as a woman if you would not participate in this. The concept was not introduced to the cult as a whole until 1976. He even told members not to worry about STDs because Jesus himself had venereal disease. Can you imagine your preacher getting on the pulpit and just being like, listen, guys, listen. I don't want you to be afraid of having unprotected sex because Jesus in Luke 14:37b said that he had gonorrhea. Can you imagine? And also, that's not a verse. That's like completely made up structure. Apparently, the ultimate free love pitch was working because by 1976, there were now 4,000 members in 70 different countries. I found this next part both hilarious and like deeply, deeply tragic. In 1978, Berg redefined communion, the act of partaking in the blood and body of Christ. So if you're not from church, I'm realizing as I'm looking at my notes, I probably need to explain this if you did not grow up in church. In church, so before Jesus died on the cross, he had a final meal with his disciples where he expresses to them basically that he's going to die, that he's sacrificing himself. And he says in scripture, in the Bible, take of this bread, it is my body, it is for forgiveness for you. This is not direct quotes. Please don't send me nasty emails. I'm summarizing. And he also takes a cup of wine and he says, this is my blood, drink for the forgiveness of sins. And this is a very important tradition in both Catholic and Christian churches, where it's kind of an establishment of repentance. It's partaking of the blood and body of Christ, basically re-acknowledging in a very regular, very deeply religious way what his sacrifice was for us. That is a very, very general summary. But in a church, what you do with communion, and so this is an evangelical church, Catholic church is different. But in an evangelical church, typically what they do is they will pass out these little crackers or wafers of some kind. The preacher will read the passage of scripture where Jesus says, take, eat my body for the forgiveness of sins. And then everyone in the congregation eats the wafer or the cracker at the same time. They do the same thing with the wine, which is usually grape juice or a sparkling non-alcoholic wine of some kind. And it's just, again, it's a deeply introspective religious practice, and it's called communion. So David Berg in 1978 redefines communion, the practice that I just described, as cum-union. Okay? C-U-M-union. Which essentially became orgy sessions. So instead of this deeply religious looking towards Christ and his sacrifice, it's cum-union. Like, I feel like that should be a joke that I made up, but it's not. Anyways, flirty fishing is now enforced on all members at this time and quickly becomes full-out prostitution. The money that the women are making from this is a significant form of funding for the church. Many of these girls were minors. Yikes, yikes, yikes. It literally became referred to, and again, I'm not joking, none of this is a joke. It became referred to as hooking for Jesus. Man, reality sometimes is so much weirder than fiction. Berg has officially become a pimp of a 4,000 member organization. One former member reported that he had $1 million in cash stored under his bed, most of it made from this global prostitution ring he was now running. This global prostitution and sex trafficking minors obviously begins to attract the attention of the press and law enforcement. During this time, obviously, a lot of babies started to be born to the cult because David Berg also outlawed birth control. What better way to grow your cult than to have children born into it? Berg deemed these Jesus babies and even had one of his own with wife number 2. Very sadly, this boy would grow up repeatedly sexually abused by church members, eventually stabbing one of his abusers to death when he was an adult before he took his own life. Nobody was ever charged in his sexual abuse. To avoid more scrutiny in the wake of the Jonestown massacre, David disbanded his compounds for a few years, but actively kept members informed with orders from his Mo letters. He encouraged them to move to the suburbs, integrate into cities, integrate into real life, but still listen to me, pay attention to me. He moved the whole movement underground until 1980, when they reformed after the attention was off and they rebranded as the Family of Love. The compound in Greece leaned heavily into Berg's deviant teaching, continuing orgies, partner swapping, flirty fishing, and now very, very open pedophilia. Berg began actively teaching members how to sexualize children. In fact, he released several copies of pornographic literature to expose your children to at young ages, to sexualize them very, very young. He was very insistent on this. And instead of everyone leaving this horrible monster, membership grows to about 12,000, and the implications of that are startling. Think about, you come out with very blatant, very open pedophilia now, and you go from 4,000 members to 12,000. I find that deeply disturbing. And quite frankly, if you spend any time on social media, the amount of people who defend grooming and pedophilia is shocking. It's shocking. And I don't want to negate the fact that women can obviously be abusers too, but it's mostly men. And I see so many comments from men. I read one recently that was so deeply disturbing. How did he say it? He said, oh no, it wasn't a guy on social media. It was a senator from New Hampshire. New Hampshire just passed a law outlawing child marriage. Just now, in 2024, this was a couple weeks ago. In New Hampshire, you can no longer marry a minor. But this Republican senator who was opposed to this law outlawing child marriage describes teenage girls as ripe and fertile and says that basically if they can get pregnant, they should be able to get married. It's disturbing. Anyways, so it's not as uncommon as we think it is, or that we wish it was maybe. Berg wrote, the only way to get free of the devil and his lies and his prohibitions and his guilt complexes about sex is to get rid of his lies and lying propaganda, his anti-sex propaganda, and believe the Lord and his word and his creation of God's love and his freedom, that there is nothing in the world wrong with sex as long as it is practiced in love. This next part. Whatever it is, or whoever it's with, no matter who or what age or what relative or what manner. He wrote that. That is a direct quote. John and Arlen Phoenix, archbishops of the Children of God in Venezuela and Trinidad, received this letter and promptly removed their children, River, Rain, and Joaquin, out of the cult and relocated to Miami to protect their children. And yes, it is the Joaquin Phoenix of Walk the Line and Joker fame. His parents were archbishops in the Children of God cult who left after David released this particular letter encouraging people to have sex with children and encouraging incest. As a matter of fact, they took on the name Phoenix to signify their rebirth as a family once they left the cult. Just an interesting little bit of trivia. Absolutely wild. During this time of 1980 to 1994, the group continued to hide Berg and cover him in spite of recurring investigations. And finally, on October 1st, 1994, Berg died of natural causes at the age of 75. Throughout the last 14 years of his life, he continued his doctrine of sexual abuse, coerced prostitution, and it continued within the cult, as did child molestation. His second wife took over leadership of the cult, now called the Family International, and is still in charge to this day, as far as I can tell. Even while he was alive, she would make prophecies to the cult, including one in 1986, denouncing sexual relationships between adults and minors. But this really seemed all for show, because the pedophilia was rampant all the way into the 2000s, and to be honest with you, probably is still rampant today because this cult is still active. Members who have escaped as late as 2005 have said that the child abuse in particular is still incredibly rampant. Several more people left the cult in years following and gave the same story. In 2018, a Scottish woman named Verity Carter, who was raised in the cult until she was 15, spoke out against the cult and gave her experiences in hope of stopping other children from experiencing what she went through. The BBC reported it this way. Verity Carter says growing up in a secretive cult that encouraged sexual contact between adults and children was hell on earth. The 38-year-old says she was abused from the age of 4 by members of the Children of God cult, including her own father. Her father, Alexander Watt, was convicted in February of 2018 after admitting 4 charges of sexually abusing Verity and another child in Renfrewshire, on the east coast of Scotland in the 1980s. Verity confirmed that sex at any age was encouraged, including with minors as young as 2 or 3 years old. I like to believe that in many cases, people are capable of redemption, right? I do believe in that for the most part. If you sexually violate a 2 or 3-year-old, I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. You deserve to be killed slowly. Because you cannot, I'm of the personal belief that you cannot be that sick and be rehabilitated. Best case scenario, you should be locked away from everyone else for the rest of your life. Worst case scenario, you should be castrated and allowed to bleed out. I know that sounds extreme, but how could you possibly do that to a 3-year-old? Like, I'm sorry. It makes me so angry. As well as sexual abuse, Verity says that she was repeatedly beaten and whipped for the smallest of transgressions. It became hell on earth for anyone born into it, she says. It happens a step at a time, and many of the adults did not see how extreme it had gotten until it was too late. And I do believe that with cults, people kind of fall into this sunk cost fallacy, even when they realize they've been in it too long, that things are getting super weird. Maybe this person isn't what they said they were. They're like, well, I've been here for years. My whole family's here. I left my family behind. I sold everything. I can't leave. We had no contact from the outside world, says Verity. We didn't have music or television or culture. We had no idea how the world worked, and they were not allowed to receive a formal education. The cult was worried that if the kids went to school, teachers, nurses, or counselors would pick up on something being wrong, or a child might let slip what was going on inside the commune. They were taught survival skills and how to keep secrets from the systemites in the outside world, especially social workers. There were heavy consequences if you failed to keep that smile and say the things you were meant to say, she said. They were told terrible things would happen to them and their siblings if there was bad publicity for the group. As a cover, Verity's mother and father claimed to be Christian missionaries, and Verity said that she was forced on the streets to trick people into donating money, often bringing in as much as 400 pounds per day that would immediately be given to church leadership. Verity said, I wasn't comfortable with the things being done to me, but if I asked a question, I got beaten or put on silence restriction. People didn't question it because nobody wants to be accused of being prejudiced against someone of an alternate belief system. So basically, a lot like social workers would be called from time to time, but they wouldn't pry enough because of this weird, I don't want to offend someone's religion. If you suspect that a child is being raped, please violate someone's religious beliefs. Because that's a crime. She says her days with the cult were very regimented and any signs of imagination would be beaten out of her. Verity said there was sexual abuse from myself from the age of 4, not just from my dad who got convicted, but from various other members of the cult, some related and some not. She said from the time she was old enough to learn things like brushing her teeth, she was taught that sex is love, and it was encouraged to engage in sexual activity at all ages, and that pornographic material from Grandpa David was all over the house. Man. She says later that I was punished a lot because I was never able to stop asking questions. Verity says she was living in the communes full-time from 11 or 12 and that she escaped at the age of 15. She says she reached a stage where she no longer cared what happened to her and refused to submit to the cult's punishments. When I got out, it was because it no longer mattered if death waited for me in the outside world because I already wanted to die. So how much worse could it be? At first, she went to live with her father and liked the fact that he was spending money on her. She said that he was trying to compensate for the past. She said she approached him about the past, and he said that he was sorry, and it was all down to the cult's teachings. However, when he invaded her personal space as a teenager, she gave him a black eye and moved out. You go, girl. She said, I was living on my own when I was 16 and in a place where they did not ask any questions. There was a lot to get used to. I knew nothing. I made a lot of mistakes and I wasn't perfect. Yeah, you're a 16-year-old who's never been exposed to the world. She said, to be perfectly honest, for a good few years, I went off the rails. I was trying to understand the whole alien world I wasn't prepared for. She says she suffered from depression, suicidal thoughts, as well as nightmares and insomnia, and spent several years on a significant level of drugs and alcohol to erase the past. Today, she does seem happy, healthy, and well-adjusted, and that is a testament to such incredible strength. Like, of course you're going to go wild when you get into the world. You've been told your whole life that if you go out into this world, you're going to die. and you've been abused your whole life, you have no healthy sense of self or sex or anything, yeah, you're going to go nuts when you go out to the world. But bravo on her for getting out and for adjusting. As I said, this cult is still currently active as the Family International. Although they say that they do not condone pedophilia, it is evident from members who continue to escape the cult that it is still very much encouraged to have sex at any age within the children of God. Exhausting. It's just, man, how people can get, again, I'm looking at it from the outside in. I'm sure, there's reasons people fall into it. But man, when your church leader is telling you that you can, anyways, before I jump into my travel recommendations for Los Angeles, let's go over today's highway highlights. David Berg founded his sex cult in 1968 in Huntington Beach, and it, unfortunately, survives to this day. Number 2, the controversy around the cult revolved around its sexual practices, starting with Berg taking a second wife, then orgies with high-ranking members, and then the culture at large, destroying traditional monogamy, making women of the cult prostitutes, and finally, open and rampant pedophilia. Number 3, despite all the allegations of abuse, I couldn't find any high-ranking member that was ever arrested for their roles of abuse, though there have been individual arrests like Verity Carter's father. Man, it's crazy that they're still around. Anyways, let's go into travel recommendations for Los Angeles. Los Angeles, again, is another one of these cities that has so much to offer, and so many episodes are going to take place here because it's not only the hub of so much true crime and cults and hauntings, but it's just one of those cities that you could spend years there and you wouldn't see everything. Now this is a personal opinion to all my West Coast people. Don't get mad at me. Definitely not a city that I would want to live in. I couldn't live in LA for the same reason that I love New York. It's the people. I find LA people to be, and again, this is not native LA people. It's the people who live in LA. It's very flaky and it's very like, oh, who do you know? How can you help me with what I want to do? How can you do this for me? And then as soon as you're not helpful to them in some way, then you're of no use to them. It's a very fake culture. New Yorkers get a rap for being mean, and they can be, but they're very direct. And I would rather have someone tell me they hate me to my face than to be nice to my face and then stab me in the back when they turn around. The South is pretty bad about that too. But LA is a fabulous place to visit. I have lots of recommendations. I need to actually get back to LA for a visit. It's been a while, but let's travel to LA. And I'm going to start with iconic touristy things. There's so much history in LA, especially if you're a music and film fan, obviously. The first thing I would recommend is the Sunset Strip. So unbelievably iconic restaurant, bars, just absolutely famous music venues. It extends from Marmont Lane and borders with Beverly Hills at Phyllis Street. It's known especially for its nightclubs and its rock clubs. I would specifically recommend going to the Rainbow. So this is a restaurant and rock club frequented by members of Led Zeppelin, John Lennon, Alice Cooper, and even Johnny Cash in its heyday. The restaurant is on the lower level and the upper level is a club. It is like, it's just walking in, these recommendations I'm going to give, it's like walking into a time portal. And you walk in and I'm like, man, I wish I could have been here for some of the shows that were played here. The Sunset Strip was also really, really influential in particularly the 80s rock movement, like the hair metal, the Motley Crue, the AC/DC, Guns N' Roses. Super, super important to the history of those bands. The second venue I would definitely recommend is Whiskey A Go-Go. Super, super famous venue. And again, it's when you walk in and they still have bands playing. And unfortunately, a lot of it has turned into pay to play. Like you buy onto a bill as an artist or a musician, but again, it's still really incredible. And it's still such an iconic piece of history. A really interesting story about Whiskey A Go-Go. So Jeremy Spencer, who was a founding member of Fleetwood Mac, there's an interesting tie-in with this cult. He and Fleetwood Mac were booked to play Whiskey A Go-Go, and he goes to a bookstore, meets some people from the Children of God cult, leaves with them, doesn't go to his own show, and joins the cult. He's still in the cult. The reason that Jeremy Spencer is no longer a member of Fleetwood Mac, or wasn't before they disbanded, was because he went and he joined the Children of God. He was still under investigations for pedophilia and child sexual assault when the statute of limitations expired in 2006. I would also recommend going to the Hollywood sign. It's just so cool. And the hiking is really great up there. LA has a lot of really amazing hiking, and all you have to do is just do a Google search. It's everywhere you want to be. It's so beautiful. I especially recommend Topanga Canyon. Really pretty. I went hiking there the last time I was there, and I had never been there all the times I've been to LA, and it was incredible. What I will give LA credit for that I love is just obviously the weather is immaculate, and the hiking is incredible. It truly, truly is. Also go to the Getty Observatory. I found this to be super intriguing and inspiring. It's very meditative. Really, really worth seeing. For you comedy fans, go to the Laugh Factory. It is a super iconic comedy club. I have been to a couple shows there, and it has never disappointed. Never disappointed at all. And let's talk food. I'm going to give some kind of interesting recommendations on this. And I want to shout out my friend Gilbert Baba for he sent me a list of places out because he lives in LA. He's been there for a long time. And I was having such a hard time with these headaches. I couldn't remember places that I had been, and I was just and I sent him a list. I was like, can you just remind me of some of these places or help me decide? And he helped me kind of narrow down my list and reminded me of some places I've been that I had forgotten about. And one of them is Pink's Hot Dogs. So I am not a hot dog person, but these are so delicious and they're huge. If you're in Nashville and you love Daddy's Dogs, which is super, kind of iconic here in Nashville, Pink's are even bigger and they're so good. And I loved the story. So Betty and Paul Pink are the founder of Pink's Hot Dogs. They used a $50 loan from Betty's mother to buy a hot dog cart in 1939. And it has been family owned for the last 78 years. It was just a simple chili dog recipe. And it's become this iconic food space that is owned by the family. It's on the corner of, I think, is it La Brea and Melrose? Yes, La Brea and Melrose. And really worth it. So if you're just looking for a cheap lunch, grab something. This is just so delicious and just a really kind of heartwarming environment. I am a big brunch and breakfast person, and Pan's Diner is so amazing. It's like this 1950s coffee shop. It's got this triangular roof line. It's very soul food centric. So there's wings, chicken and waffles. The lines are really long on the weekends, so get there early or go during the week is a lot better. The coffee is hot and it's fresh, and I just love the diner experience. Just go order just these massive amounts of coffee and bacon and eggs.
Just give me all the bacon and eggs you have. Wait. I worry what you just heard was, give me a lot of bacon and eggs. What I said was, give me all the bacon and eggs you have.
I had to include that quote. So many good references today. And my last restaurant recommendation I'm going to give, there's two more. So second to last, in Sherman Oaks, there's a Middle Eastern restaurant called Carnival. And I would say that if I had to pick one cuisine that is my favorite, it would be Middle Eastern in all forms. I studied abroad in Israel, and the food was the best thing that's ever happened to me. And when I lived in New York, I lived in Queens, and it was this, in Astoria, so much incredible Greek food and Middle Eastern food. So this place in particular really scratches that itch for me because I am very particular about the quality of Middle Eastern food, because when it is done right, it is immaculate. When it is not done right, it's just awful. They have incredible baba ganoush and shawarma. So if you love this kind of, this is the place to go. Carnival is so amazing and also super surprising. Even things like their French fries are just so good. Everything there, you can just tell, is prepared so well with so much care and so much effort. I 10 out of 10 recommend. And the last restaurant I'm going to recommend is Yamashiro Hollywood, which is a Japanese fusion restaurant, sushi. You have to have reservations here. It is one of the most breathtaking restaurants I've ever been to. It was actually built in a hilltop mansion that was built in 1914 that is a replica of a palace in Kyoto, Japan. And it's expansive, beautiful views of the city. The food is amazing. And there's this beautiful outdoor spacious garden. There's koi fish, some of which are over 60 years old. really unbelievably immaculate and surprising. This was one that Gilbert reminded me of that I was like, wait a minute, I've been to this restaurant. I remember going here. And it's so, so good. This is another one. I always like to recommend like a really cool dining experience or maybe a little bit more fancy experience. This would be the one I'd recommend. It's just a once in a lifetime experience. I haven't encountered another restaurant like this anywhere I've been. And let's talk about bars. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that I love anything that is speakeasy or prohibition era. So my first recommendation is the Melrose Umbrella Company. This is a prohibition themed cocktail bar, and the drinks are it's really well balanced. Because sometimes I feel like I walk into a bar and it's all the same flavor profiles, or it's one thing that they specialize in. This bar is across the board just incredibly, incredibly good. It's bright and refreshing. They have stuff from the tropics, things that are very spirit forward. It's also the kind of place that you can just go to the bartender and say, hey, I like this type of alcohol and this kind of flavor, and they'll just make you something incredible. It has really, really good mixologists here, and it is one of the most beautiful bars in the interior. It's just, they've got these beautiful warm light chandeliers and brown leather. It just, the whole place kind of glows. It's like you transport it into this like ancient space, and it just glows gold. Very, very El Dorado vibes. A more casual bar but has amazing vibes is Waltz Bar. So this is like dive bar meets pinball arcade, and it is so cool. It's very, very affordable drinks. They've got like giant pretzels, hot dogs. I think they have vegan dogs, and they have $5 tournament nights. Just really fun, really casual. If you're from Nashville or live in Nashville and you're familiar with Pins Mechanical, it's like that, but it's much more, there's more food options and things like that. This is your more casual, just super fun to go hang out and have a cheap drink. And this bar is very, very like old Hollywood, very old glamour. And typically when I'm in LA, I don't go to Hollywood Boulevard a lot. Again, I just try to avoid really touristy areas. It's kind of like when I'm in New York, I don't go to Times Square. But if you're willing to navigate it, the spare room is in the Hollywood Roosevelt, and the cocktails, everything here is refined. That's the best word I can think of. It's refined. It's very old Hollywood. It's very elegant, and it really feels like traveling back in time. Like, I love kind of the classic Hollywood era as far as the aesthetic and the glow. The spare room is very much that. So if you are like an old Hollywood buff, you want something a little bit glamorous, just go to the spare room. This is just amazing. And they've really managed to capture that kind of old Hollywood allure and also give it this really cool modern take on everything. One other food place I wanted to mention because I forgot about it. There is an elote man, or a corn man, that runs a cart in Los Angeles. The lines for this man, it looks like people are lining up for a concert. It's completely unbelievable, and it's Mexican style street corn. It's literally just a corn food stand, but it is so good that it literally draws lines. So when you're there, it moves around because it's a cart. Just look up the elote man, the corn stand, and absolutely go find it. It would be a shame for me to not mention any kind of Tex-Mex with Los Angeles being so good in that particular department. That is one you absolutely have to try. It is worth the wait. And then I'm going to give some travel recommendations that are kind of in their own category because they're not super touristy. They're not restaurants and bars, but they're still super interesting and unique to LA. One is the library, the Huntington Library and Gardens. So it's a historic library museum, and they have these beautiful sprawling Chinese gardens. It is such a unique experience, and I'm such a book lover. This is just I had never seen a library set up this way. The library is immaculate and beautiful, and then you're walking in between the buildings in the museum, and there's these like perfectly manicured, restful, peaceful gardens you can go read in. It is really, really, really amazing, and just such a unique place to go visit if books are your thing. And also, we can't talk about LA without talking about a little bit of film. Recently, the Egyptian Theater is now open after a 3-year restoration. It is a 101-year-old theater, and was home to the first Hollywood premiere. It's owned by Netflix now, but you can go watch a movie there, or they do special events or special premieres, and it is beautiful. I would absolutely go to the Egyptian Theater if you can get in. Obviously, this is another situation where tickets in advance are super, super helpful. If you can't get into the Egyptian Theater, go to the Vista, which is now under the ownership of Quentin Tarantino, and is once again regularly screening films. It's also a very old, very classic theater in Los Angeles. And that is all for today's episode on the Children of God sex cult and Los Angeles. Again, LA being a place that we're going to go back to over and 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 over. Thank you so much for being patient with me today. For those of you on YouTube, just getting to listen to it instead of seeing my face. Laying on this ice pack for this hour has been life-changing, and I can actually blink without wanting to cry. I want to say a special thank you to the people who have subscribed to the podcast. I'm almost up to 100 subscribers already, which is pretty amazing to me. I have some special announcements and a special little twist coming up next week for the 10th episode of Highway to Hell. And of course, you can always send comments, questions, recommendations to montyashleymater@gmail. I have so many cool things that are coming with next week's episode. And again, thank you so much for supporting me. I get messages every week from people, whether it's on Instagram or in my email, about the podcast and just what I'm doing with it and the growth and the people loving true crime and travel, which is so awesome for me to be doing this for the last few weeks. Have a safe week. Have so much fun. Be curious, be adventurous. Thanks for rolling down the highway with me, and I'll see you next week on Highway to Hell.